In previous sections, I've shown you how to use Ansible to gather facts from networking devices and to execute simple show commands on networking devices. Now let's start talking about how to do simple config actions on Ansible network devices, on networking devices. So I'm going to start with some of the NXOS modules. So the very first thing we need to get done with NXOS modules is I always like to start out with getting NXOS facts or platform_facts working. So here we have the NXOS_facts documentation. So we're going to be working here with two Nexus switches running sort of the virtual Nexus, and we'll be connecting to those. So first of all, I've updated my Ansible hosts to create an NXOS group. Here's the two Nexus switches that I'm going to be talking to. Here's the SSH connection information for those two Nexus switches. And these two Nexus switches are in DNS, so this resolves to an IP address that we can both SSH into and that we can also reach through NX API. And the NX API is listening on port 8443. So the port we're going to connect to for NX API is going to be this 8443. Okay, so now let's go ahead. I'm going to move my current one. Well, let's go ahead and look at nxosfacts.yaml and see what I have constructed here. So here's my playbook. I've got a name, I've got my hosts, and I'm pulling this group from our Ansible inventory. And then I'm creating a provider where I'm going to do for the SSH connection. Very similar to what we saw for eAPI. We have a host, username, password, and the transport. And then we also have an NX API provider, host, username, password. We have a transport, NX API. I say to use SSL, I set this to true. I set the validate certs to no because this is a self-signed certificate. And then I specify the port. So very similar to what we saw for doing EOS facts on Arista. And then I go down here and I execute two tasks. So I do NXOS facts, and I do the provider with the SSH, and then I do NXOS facts, and I do the provider with NX API. So I'm just testing each one of those out, and I'm going to get rid of this gather subset argument. So let's go ahead and test that and see if our fact gathering works properly. So now it should be talking SSH to those two remote switches. So there we see NXOS2 and NXOS1 come back. So the SSH communication worked. Now let's see if the NX API communication also works. And there we see that the fact gathering process worked for NX API. So now that we know we have basic communication working, the next thing I want to do is try to configure a set of VLANs on the two NXOS switches. So let's go ahead and set this up. So the first thing I'm going to do is I know I'm going to use the NXOS VLAN module. So now this is a specific module that's been created, and it's in Ansible Core that lets you configure VLANs on Nexus switches. So go ahead and make this a little bit bigger. We'll look at an example of this in the documentation. So here's the module, NXOS VLAN. Here's if you're configuring a VLAN range. Here's if you're configuring a specific VLAN ID. So here's the VLAN ID, admin state, the name, and then the rest of the information looks like a connection arguments. So now let's copy this, and we'll copy our NXOS fax.yaml. Let's see. I'm going to move NXOS VLAN, just some experimentation ones I was using earlier, into .orig. I'm going to copy NXOS fax.yaml into NXOS VLAN.yaml. Edit NXOS to VLAN. So this is the same exact thing that we had for our fact gathering. Now, as opposed to doing fax here, we're now going to start doing our VLAN operations. So we know we need our provider. I want to use NXAPI. So let's start by trying to use NXAPI. And let's go ahead and configure VLAN 550. We'll give it a name. Call this the black VLAN. And we'll give it an admin state of up. Okay, so we're going to use NXOS VLAN module. We're providing it with the provider for its username, password, the other things it needs for connecting using NXAPI. We're going to configure a VLAN ID of 550. It's going to be the up state, and we're going to give it this name for the black VLAN. I had previously, earlier today, configured a blue VLAN, a red VLAN, a green VLAN, so there are some existing VLANs on that switch, on those two switches. And let's go ahead and add a name argument, and we'll call this configure Nexus VLANs. Okay, and let's go ahead and execute our playbook. Now it should be configuring that one VLAN on those two Nexus switches. Now I'm going to verify that the VLANs are configured, so I'm going to actually use NetMiko tools to do this, and this should be installed in the lab environment as well, although you might potentially have to set it up. It should be installed in the lab environment. The inventory may or may not contain the Nexus switches. It probably will. But you should be able to use NetMiko tools in the lab environment as well. So here I'm going to do NetMiko show. I'm going to execute the command show VLAN, and I'm going to operate on this group Nexus. So these are some special tools that I've created. They're open source, but it makes it easier to gather information from programmatically gather information from devices. Okay, so there's a little bit of a line wrap going on, so let's get rid of that. But here you see the configured VLANs. Here's ones I configured earlier, and here's this VLAN 550 with this black configured, and you see it's configured on both Nexus 1 and Nexus 2. So at this point, we've configured a single VLAN on the two Nexus switches. Now let's expand on this and start configuring a set of VLANs on the two Nexus switches. Okay, so I'm going to copy Now I'm going to copy our current playbook, and I'm just going to name it So this is exactly what we just had. We configured VLAN ID 550. But now, instead of configuring a single VLAN, let's make a data structure called VLANs. And let's take these three variables. We'll make this be list element 1, and then we'll make another one, and we'll call this and we'll give it some arbitrary colors. Call this one pink. Okay, so VLANs, VLAN ID 550, 551, 552, all up, and various VLAN names. Now, we have this variable. Now, how do we call it to use it down in our tasks? So here is where we need to call our with items. So we have a list up here, the variable we're going to use from our with items, and remember this from our earlier discussions on this looping construct inside of Ansible. So we're going to loop over the VLANs. And let me copy these three, put them in here. Now, what are the variables that we take in here? So now we're not going to hard code this. Instead, we're going to call the variable item, which item will be each one of these as it goes through them. And then for VLAN ID, we need the key VLAN ID. Similarly for admin state, and I happen to choose the names exactly the same in the dictionary just to try to make it be easier. So this one will be item.admin state. This one will be item.name. Now, if this works properly, each time through the for loop, item, and I misspelled that, that needs to be item. Item will be one of these dictionaries, and then it'll get the corresponding value for VLAN underscore ID, admin underscore state, and name. Then it'll go through the for loop the next time and configure that one, and then it'll go through it the last time and configure the third one. So let's go ahead and try to execute this playbook where we're configuring 3 VLANs in this VLANs data structure and where we're using this with underscore items to accomplish the configuration. So here you see that one, the VLAN 550 with the name black, had already been previously configured. That was configured on our last playbook execution. There you see that we're configuring VLAN 551 with the name of orange. And now it should be configuring the last VLAN, VLAN 552, with the name of pink. If we use our NetMiko tools to verify that those are now in fact configured, and we see what we have on those remote switches. Now you see that here's Nexus 2, 551, 552. All 3 of them are configured. If we scroll up to NXOS 1, we see 550, 551, 552. So we've configured those 3 VLANs on the 2 switches. Now we're going to expand on this in the next video. In the next video, we need to start adding in, well, that's fine if all the VLANs are the same between the 2 switches, but how would we accommodate differences in the VLANs between what NXOS 1 requires and what NXOS 2 requires?